Starting from this video, we'll look at solid to solid phase transformation. There are two large categories of solid-solid phase transformation. The first is called diffusional transformation. The second is called displacive or diffusionless transformation. In the first three videos, we'll focus on the diffusional transformation, and the last video will look at the martensitic or displacive transformation. In this video specifically, we'll look at a special case of diffusional phase transformation. It is called Spinodal decomposition. Without further ado, let's go straight to the topic. Similar to what we did back in solidification, the liquid to solid phase transformation, we'll first look at the thermodynamics. In fact, the thermodynamics of solid-solid phase transformation is very similar to that in solidification. If you're not familiar with this content, you can refer back to the video 3.3. Looking at a simple example, say we're looking at iron. For iron, it is FCC at high temperature and BCC at room temperature. The high temperature FCC phase is called austenite, and the low temperature BCC phase is called ferrite. If you go from a very high temperature to low temperature, iron can undergo FCC to BCC phase transformation. This is similar to the case that in solidification, as you decrease the temperature, the material will undergo from liquid to solid phase transformation. Like any first order phase transformation event, you have BCC ion nucleating in the FCC phase as you decrease the temperature. And there are two types of nucleation. This shouldn't be a stranger to you. You have the homogeneous nucleation and heterogeneous nucleation. And also, you should know that heterogeneous nucleation is much easier compared to homogeneous nucleation. So far, we focused on the similarities between the solid to solid diffusional phase transformation and solidification. Then what are the major differences? In the case of solidification, at high temperature, you have the liquid phase. The only interface that is present is the interface between the liquid and the mold. In contrast, in the solid-solid phase transformation, the high temperature phase is a crystalline phase. Therefore, there will be grain boundaries in the high temperature phase, which can also serve as the nucleation sites for heterogeneous nucleation. In a polycrystal sample, there can be two types of interfaces. The first type is you have three grain boundaries and they meet at the triple point. At high temperature, you have those three austenite grains denoted by gamma. As temperature decreases, at the triple point, a ferrite grain will preferentially nucleate and grow, and the ferrite grain, we denote that as alpha. In the second case, it's just a simple regular grain boundary. Again, at high temperature, you have austenite on each side. As temperature decreases, the low temperature ferrite grain will nucleate at the grain boundary and eventually grow into the austenite. Comparing these two cases, nucleation of the new ferrite grain at the regular grain boundary in the second case is energetically preferable compared to the first case where nucleation happens at the triple point. Moving forward from the single component phase transformation to the binary system, here we'll use iron-carbon as the model system. This probably is the most classic system you're going to learn in either material science or in metallurgy, simply because steel is the most widely used alloy in our society. This is the iron-carbon phase diagram, and there's a special point, which is called the eutectic point. At the eutectic point, the carbon concentration is 0.65 weight%. Eutectic point basically means the lowest melting point across the compositional space. As we lower the temperature, austenite will phase transform into a phase called pearlite. Pearlite is made of alternating ferrite and cementite plates. The phase transformation process is diffusional because carbon and iron in austenite can diffuse into ferrite and cementite. For ferrite, there's relatively more iron diffused into the structure. For cementite, there's more carbon diffused into the structure. The ferrite and the cementite plates, they grow together and form the alternating structure. This collective microstructure of the cementite and the ferrite is called pearlite. There are a couple important points about pearlite formation. First of all, you do not always form pearlite. Whether you're going to form pearlite or some other phases depends on the cooling rate, which we'll discuss in more details in the next video. Second, pearlite can only form when the austenite composition is at eutectic. We'll see more of this shortly. Let's come back to the iron-carbon phase diagram and look at a few more compositions. In the first case, the composition lies on the left-hand side of the eutectic composition, so there's relatively less carbon. As you decrease the temperature, ferrite, which is lean in carbon, rich in iron, will first precipitate out along the prior austenite grain boundaries, and they will grow and push the composition into the eutectic composition. Then the remaining austenite will undergo the eutectic transformation to form pearlite. Next is the eutectic composition. We've covered that already, so we'll not spend too much time on that here. The third composition is carbon-rich, so it's on the right of the eutectic point. Again, at high temperature, we have the austenite. When you decrease the temperature, since the overall composition is carbon-rich, cementite will first form at the austenite grain boundaries. The formation of those cementite takes away the excess amount of carbon from the austenite grains, then pushes the austenite grain composition into the eutectic composition. With further decreasing temperature, you form pearlite in those austenite grains. Let's shift gears here and look at a special type of diffusional phase transformation called spinodal decomposition. Spinodal means thorn in Latin to describe the resultant microstructure. Spinodal decomposition does not happen in all systems. There are some conditions the system must satisfy before spinodal decomposition can occur. Let's look at the example here. We have the phase diagram, and let's assume we focus on T2 at that temperature. At T2, there will be phase separation, and the two phases will have composition X1 and X2 at equilibrium. The term I just added at the end of the previous sentence, at equilibrium, is very important. For X1 and X2, they also lie in the energy well in terms of the Gibbs free energy, indicating these are the most stable phases. Next, I'd like to draw your attention to two special points highlighted by the two red circles. At these 2 points, the second-order derivative of Gibbs free energy in respect to the composition is equal to 0. And we can refer these two compositions as S1 and S2. If we repeat the process at different temperatures, finding the corresponding S1s and S2s, joining them together will achieve or will get this curve. If the composition falls in between S1 and S2, that's within this curve, something magic may happen. Assume we have a composition highlighted by the purple heart, X0, that's between S1 and S2. If we cool down the system from a high temperature, it can phase separate into two phases with composition S1 and S2. We call this phase separation spinodal decomposition. Note that S1 and S2, they do not correspond to the lowest level of the Gibbs free energy. Therefore, this system is not at equilibrium. Now, let's move to the second example with composition X0 prime. This composition lies outside S1 and S2, or it lies outside the spinodal. Therefore, when we cool down the system from high temperature, it will phase separate into two compositions corresponding to X1 and X2. Spinodal decomposition will not happen at this composition, and the phase separation is governed by the classical nucleation and the growth mechanism. Usually, just by looking at the microstructure, you'll be able to tell whether the system has undergone the classical nucleation growth mechanism or the spinodal decomposition mechanism. In the classical nucleation and growth mechanism, the microstructure is either plates, laths, or droplets. In contrast, for spinodal decomposition, usually the microstructure exhibits the bicontinuous morphology. I'll just quickly add one note here on the microstructure resulted from the spinodal decomposition. If you are able to etch away one of the two phases, the end result is you're obtaining a nanoporous material. Here is a phase field model showing the spinodal decomposition. First of all, there's no nucleation events. Secondly, the process is spontaneous and happens everywhere in the microstructure. And thirdly, the composition changes over time in each phase. All these features are in contrast to the classical nucleation and growth mechanism. In this video, I hope you have obtained a good overview of diffusional phase transformation, as well as learning the spinodal decomposition is a special case in diffusional phase transformation. In the next video, we'll focus on the iron-carbon phase diagram and learn how the cooling rate can affect the final phase transformation product.